On live TV, Whoopi Goldberg laughed at Keanu Reeves' necklace, mocking him in front of millions. But when Keanu opened the tiny cross on his chest, the entire studio went silent. What was inside didn't just stop the show, it shattered her. And what Keanu said next will stay with you forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The cameras were rolling, the lights blinding, and the studio audience was buzzing with anticipation. It was a typical day on set, or at least it seemed that way. Whoopi Goldberg leaned back in her chair with her trademark grin, eyeing Keanu Reeves across the glossy table. The audience was ready for another lighthearted celebrity interview, unaware that what was about to unfold would be anything but typical. With a playful smirk, Whoopi gestured toward Keanu's chest. Her tone was casual, but her words carried an unmistakable edge. "Keanu, you still wearing that little charm?" she asked, her fingers subtly pointing to the small silver cross hanging around his neck. The audience chuckled. It was the kind of laughter that isn't quite sure if it's supposed to exist. The sound was thin, uneasy, as if people were waiting for the cue that never came. She continued, her smile widening. "For real, or is that just Hollywood accessorizing these days?" The jab was meant to be funny, a quick punchline to lighten the mood, but it landed differently. The audience's laughter trickled into silence. Some smiled awkwardly, while others glanced at Keanu, curious about how he would respond. Keanu didn't move. He didn't shift in his seat or offer a charming comeback. He simply sat there, still and composed, as if the words hadn't touched him at all. But they had. You could see it in the subtle tightening of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. Not anger, not embarrassment, something deeper, something steadier. The camera, sensing a moment, zoomed in on Whoopi, expecting her to capitalize on the pause. This was her stage. This was where she owned the room. But the longer Keanu stayed silent, the more the balance began to tilt. Whoopi leaned in, trying to push the moment forward. "I mean, come on, Keanu. You're John Wick, Neo. You don't really believe a piece of metal's got powers, do you?" The audience laughed again, but this time it wasn't laughter that filled the room. It was laughter that escaped, trying to fill a space that had suddenly grown too large, too uncomfortable. The silence that followed Whoopi's words felt heavier, like the air itself had thickened. People shifted in their seats. The co-hosts glanced at each other, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. Keanu's fingers lifted slowly, tracing the edge of the cross. His movements were deliberate, tender, as if he was handling something fragile. He let the necklace fall back against his chest without a word. The studio was quiet, but not empty. It was filled with something unspoken, something no one could put their finger on yet. Whoopi sat back, clearly expecting Keanu to break the tension with one of his signature, self-deprecating smiles, the kind that makes awkward moments disappear. But Keanu didn't rescue her. He let the silence stay. And that silence started to grow teeth. The audience wasn't sure where to look anymore. Some turned their attention to Whoopi, waiting for her next line. Others were glued to Keanu, wondering if they were about to witness a rare celebrity outburst. But Keanu didn't give them either. His face was calm, his eyes focused, not on Whoopi, but somewhere deeper. Somewhere she hadn't expected him to go. The studio lights buzzed faintly, filling the dead air. A co-host shifted in her seat, nervously glancing at her cue cards, but no one dared cut into the moment. Whoopi leaned forward, doubling down, though her voice carried an uneasy undertone. "Don't get me wrong, it's a beautiful piece, but you're a rational guy. You've seen the world, you've done the Matrix, for heaven's sake. You know what's real, what's simulation, so why the necklace?" It was the kind of question meant to pull a chuckle, a wink, and a clever soundbite. But this time, it didn't land. Keanu's stillness wasn't an act of defiance. It was an act of presence. He wasn't playing along, and the audience felt it. The usual rhythm of the show, the banter, the laughs, the quick fire back and forth, had been disrupted. The control room whispered urgently in headsets, "Cue the next segment. Break the tension." But no one on set moved. They couldn't. The dynamic had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. Keanu finally turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting Whoopi's. It wasn't a glare, it wasn't a smirk. It was something more disarming. It was the look of someone who had been asked this question many times, but had never been mocked for it. At least, not like this. The air in the studio grew heavier, like a collective breath was being held. The audience, once eager for entertainment, now found themselves leaning in, not out of amusement, but out of genuine curiosity. What was he going to say? But Keanu didn't speak. Not yet. He simply reached up again, his fingers brushing the chain, and for a moment it was as if the necklace wasn't a prop or a fashion statement, it was a lifeline. The camera zoomed in, catching every detail. The silver cross glinted under the studio lights. But what drew everyone in was Keanu's expression. Calm, yet carrying a weight that didn't need words. Whoopi, sensing she was losing control of the moment, tried to pivot. "All right, Mr. Reeves, I see you're playing it cool today," she said, forcing a laugh. But even she knew the joke fell flat. This wasn't her moment anymore. She had unknowingly stepped into something she couldn't laugh her way out of. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. The nervous chuckles had faded into an uneasy stillness, as if everyone realized at once that they had wandered into sacred ground. The silver cross on Keanu's chest was no longer a quirky accessory to joke about. It was something far more personal, something no one had the right to question, yet Whoopi had. Keanu's eyes didn't waver. He remained seated, hands resting calmly on his lap. But his silence was no longer passive. It had weight. It pressed into the room, filling every inch of space, making every person present feel like they were witnessing something important, something raw, the kind of moment television rarely captures without a script. One of the co-hosts attempted to lighten the mood, tossing out a quick joke about Keanu being a man of mystery, but it fell flat, landing with a dull thud in the silence. The viewers at home could feel it too, the tension through the screen. People weren't reaching for the remote. They were holding their breath. Whoopi, a veteran of live television, sensed the shift. This was no longer a fun segment. She glanced towards the producers off stage, searching for a lifeline, but none came. She was on her own now, face to face with a man who had quietly dismantled the power dynamic she was used to controlling. So, is it a good luck charm, Keanu? Or is there a story you're saving for the next blockbuster? She said, her tone forced, reaching for humor that wasn't there. Keanu's response was not loud nor dramatic. It was a simple movement. He reached behind his neck and unclasped the chain. The soft metallic sound of the necklace sliding into his hand echoed louder than any audience reaction. He held it in his palm, his thumb brushing over the tiny cross with a tenderness that silenced even the faintest whispers in the audience. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't performing. It was as if time itself had slowed down to make room for this moment. Whoopi watched, her smirk faltering. For a fleeting second, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. The kind of uncertainty that comes when you realize you've asked a question you're not prepared to hear the answer to. Keanu lifted his gaze, meeting hers, not with defiance, but with a calm resolve. The camera captured every detail. The stillness of his body, the quiet strength in his hands, the glint of the cross that now felt impossibly significant. And then, without raising his voice, Keanu spoke. "There's a reason I never take this off." The words were soft, but they hit like a thunderclap. The audience sat in absolute stillness, as if the air had been sucked from the room. Whoopi opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. She had no idea that the next few seconds would turn a simple interview into a moment the world would never forget. Keanu held the small silver cross in his palm, his fingers tracing its edges with a gentleness that quieted the room even further. The lights overhead hummed faintly, but no one moved. Whoopi Goldberg sat frozen in her chair, her usual quick wit and sharp humor caught somewhere between disbelief and discomfort. The audience, sensing the gravity of the moment, leaned in, their attention no longer divided between entertainment and distraction. They were locked onto Keanu, waiting. Slowly, Keanu turned the cross over, his movements careful, deliberate. With a subtle motion, he pressed his thumb against the back of the pendant. A small clasp, barely visible under the studio lights, clicked open. He didn't rush. His hands didn't tremble. There was a steadiness in him, a quiet reverence that made the small action feel monumental. Inside the cross was a tiny compartment, no larger than a fingernail. Resting within it was a speck of ash, enclosed in a clear casing, so delicate it seemed to shimmer under the spotlight. Keanu held it up, not dramatically, but with the kind of care reserved for things too precious for words. "This isn't for the cameras," he said, his voice calm, his gaze unwavering. "This is my sister." The words landed like a wave crashing through the studio. The audience's reaction was visceral. Some gasped, others covered their mouths, and a few instinctively reached out as if to steady themselves against the sudden shift in atmosphere. Even the seasoned camera operators, who had seen every kind of celebrity moment imaginable, exchanged glances. This was different. This wasn't rehearsed or scripted. This was real. Whoopi's smile vanished. Her hand, once confidently holding her cue cards, lowered slowly to the desk. Her eyes darted to the necklace, then to Keanu's face, as if trying to reconcile the weight of his words with the man sitting quietly before her. For once, she had no snappy comeback, no clever retort. Keanu continued, his tone soft but filled with an unmistakable resolve. "My sister gave me this necklace before her last surgery. She knew she might not wake up. She asked me to wear it, to keep her close." His fingers gently closed the clasp, securing the ashes back inside. "I promised her I would never take it off." The air in the studio grew heavier, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the truth being spoken. Audience members exchanged looks, their earlier amusement replaced with something deeper, an unspoken understanding of the sacredness of what they were witnessing. Keanu wasn't angry. He wasn't here to accuse or to embarrass. He was simply telling the truth, a truth that didn't need volume to command the room. It was the kind of truth that sat in your chest, making it impossible to look away, impossible to pretend it was just another segment on a talk show. Keanu looked out into the audience. His eyes scanned the rows, not with the gaze of a movie star commanding attention, but with the quiet of a man searching for connection. The necklace rested in his palm, no longer an accessory, but a bridge between his heart and the story no one had dared to ask about. Until now. "She was my best friend," Keanu said, his voice carrying the weight of years unspoken. When the doctors told her there wasn't much time left, she smiled. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She just asked me to make a promise. He paused, not for effect, but to gather a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. She said, "Don't let them make you hide. If you hide me, I'll always be here." The audience sat motionless, absorbing every word. No rustling papers, no murmured side conversations. It was as if the entire room had forgotten to breathe. Whoopi's usual posture, leaning forward with a ready quip, had shifted. Now, she leaned back, her arms crossed, not in defense but in retreat, as if trying to create space to process what she had just heard. Keanu's fingers closed around the cross again, cradling it like a fragile photograph from a life that no longer existed. "This isn't a symbol for the cameras. It's not a statement or a performance. It's a promise I intend to keep, no matter who laughs." There was no anger in his tone, only quiet certainty. A man in the third row wiped at his eyes, trying to be discreet. A woman near the front clutched a pendant hanging around her own neck, her fingers trembling. People in the control room, often insulated from the emotional undercurrents of the set, sat in stunned silence. Even the director, headset in place, made no call for a commercial break. Whoopi's expression softened. The smirk was gone, replaced by something rarely seen on live television: vulnerability. She cleared her throat, but the sound felt out of place, as if her body was grasping for its usual tools of control and finding them useless. "You know," Keanu continued, his gaze now returning to Whoopi, "people see a cross and they think it's about religion or image or superstition. But sometimes it's just about holding on. When you lose someone, there's no manual. No one tells you how to carry the silence they leave behind." The words hung in the air, delicate yet unshakable. For the first time since the segment began, Whoopi had no script to follow. She was no longer the host of the conversation. Keanu had quietly taken that role, not by force, but by presence. And the audience, fully aware, wasn't turning back. Whoopi's hands rested loosely on the desk now, her cue cards forgotten. Her gaze flickered between Keanu's face and the small silver cross he held so gently. For a woman who had built her career on commanding every room she entered, this moment was foreign territory. She was no longer the interviewer. She was a witness. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his posture unguarded. "There have been times when people have mocked this," he said softly, lifting the necklace into view. "Times when they called it silly, when they asked if it was just a prop. And I always smiled, always let it go, because I thought, what's the point in explaining?" He let those words settle, but today feels different. The audience was motionless. The cameras, which often scanned for audience reactions, stayed fixed on Keanu. No one in the control room dared to switch angles. This wasn't television anymore. It was something far more intimate. "I think we spend too much time trying to package grief into something acceptable," Keanu said. "We hide it behind polite smiles, quiet nods, little jokes to make it less uncomfortable. But grief doesn't shrink to make others feel better. It just waits." He turned to Whoopi again, his voice still calm, but with an edge of vulnerability that made every person in the room feel like he was speaking directly to them. "You asked me why I still wear this. The truth is, I don't wear it because I can't let go. I wear it because I choose not to forget." The simplicity of his words hit harder than any rehearsed monologue could have. The audience wasn't just listening, they were feeling it, deeply, personally. Memories of their own losses surfaced, names, faces, moments they had tucked away, hoping time would make them easier to carry. Whoopi opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her usual instinct to regain control, to lighten the mood, failed her. What could she say? She had reduced something sacred to a joke, and now she was face to face with the truth of what it really meant. "I think we're taught to believe that strength means moving on," Keanu said, his gaze never leaving hers. "But maybe real strength is remembering out loud, carrying them with you, even when the world wants you to put them down." A woman in the front row nodded, her hand pressed gently over her heart. The silence in the studio was no longer awkward. It had become reverent, sacred. Whoopi, for the first time in her career, had no words. She wasn't silenced by offense or outrage. She was silenced by truth, and the audience knew it. The C-suite team. Keanu gently placed the necklace back around his neck, his movements slow, respectful. The clasp clicked shut, but what had been opened in the room couldn't be closed again. Whoopi Goldberg sat in her chair, her fingers drumming lightly against the desk, searching for a way to reclaim the rhythm of the show. She had built her career on timing. knowing when to push, when to pull back, when to crack a joke that would lift a heavy moment. But now, faced with Keanu's unwavering calmness, every tool in her kit seemed to fail her. With a forced chuckle, she leaned forward, trying to pull the energy back into her orbit. "You know, actors can be a sentimental bunch," she said, flashing her trademarked grin. "I mean, we all carry a little something, don't we? Some of us hold on to old scripts or a favorite costume piece. Sounds like Keanu's just got a more permanent keepsake, huh?" Her tone was light, casual, even playful. But it didn't land. The laughter she expected didn't come. Instead, the audience sat quietly, their faces reflecting something deeper than amusement. They weren't looking to Whoopi for leadership anymore. Their eyes were on Keanu, waiting. The silence that followed was different from the awkward pauses of live TV. This was intentional. It was the kind of silence that asked you to feel something, to sit with it. Whoopi felt it pressing back against her, unsettling her usual command of the room. She shifted in her seat, reaching for her cue cards, though she wasn't sure which one could save her now. "I mean, don't get me wrong," she added, still forcing the smile. "It's a beautiful story, really. But you know, we've all got our ways of coping. Some of us keep busy, some of us hold on to keepsakes, and some of us, well, we make movies about it." There was a hint of sarcasm in her voice, an attempt to redirect the energy back to familiar ground, but the audience didn't follow. No one laughed. No one clapped. They were watching her, but their attention wasn't hers. It was hovering just beyond her reach, anchored to the man sitting quietly across from her. Keanu sat with the same stillness that had unsettled the room moments before. He didn't respond immediately. He let the silence breathe, knowing it was doing more than words could in that moment. And then, when he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but it filled the space with a calm authority. "Symbols don't need to make sense to everyone," he said, his eyes locking onto Whoopi's. "They only need to make sense to the heart that carries them." The simplicity of his words cut through the air, silencing even the faintest whispers in the audience. You could see it on their faces. People weren't just hearing what he said, they were feeling it. They were remembering their own symbols, their own silent promises that didn't need explanation. Whoopi blinked, her smile faltering for a split second. She knew this moment had shifted, and it wasn't going back. The weight of Keanu's words settled into the air, creating a silence that was no longer uncomfortable, but undeniable. The audience wasn't shifting in their seats anymore. They were rooted, leaning in, holding on to every word as if it was unlocking something within themselves. Whoopi could feel it. She had always known how to guide a conversation, how to bring people back with a quip or a clever redirection, but now, the usual rhythm had slipped from her grasp. She cleared her throat, a habitual reflex when things felt off-scrid. "I hear you," she said, her voice trying to regain its usual buoyancy. "But don't you think sometimes we get attached to things because we're afraid to move on? You know, holding on too tightly to the past. It can weigh a person down." Her words were meant to sound thoughtful, maybe even wise, but they came out rushed, defensive. Keanu didn't react immediately. His silence, once unsettling, now held power. He wasn't playing defense. He didn't need to. The room was with him. "Maybe," Keanu said finally, his tone gentle. "But what if it's not about holding on too tightly? What if it's about holding on the right way?" His words weren't delivered with arrogance. They came from a place of quiet reflection. We're told that strength is moving on, but I've found that real strength is remembering. Intentionally, openly, without shame. The audience exhaled, as if they had been holding their breath, waiting for that truth to be spoken aloud. A woman in the second row reached for her necklace, her fingers brushing it in the same absent, reverent way Keanu had done earlier. Another man wiped his eyes, pretending it was just a scratch. but the truth was written all over his face. Whoopi noticed. She saw the subtle shifts in the audience, the way their bodies were responding to Keanu, not with applause or performance, but with presence. This wasn't the show she had prepared for. Her instinct told her to pivot again, to regain control, but deep down, she knew she was no longer the center of this conversation. She shuffled her cards, though she wasn't reading them anymore. "Look, Keanu, I'm not trying to minimize what that necklace means to you. I respect it, really. I just think sometimes we need to be careful not to live in the past. Life's happening now, right?" Her words hung in the air, searching for a response that would soften the ground she was standing on. But Keanu didn't rush to fill the space. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, offering a small, understanding smile. "The past doesn't disappear just because we pretend it's over," he said softly. "It walks with us, every day. The question isn't whether we should carry it, it's how we choose to." That simple statement shifted the energy yet again. The audience wasn't just listening now, they were feeling seen. Whoopi's fingers tapped nervously against the desk, her rhythm uneven. She could feel it now. The segment was slipping through her hands. The more she tried to steer it back to familiar ground, the further it drifted into something deeper, something raw. The show's usual script had been quietly dismantled by Keanu's unwavering calm, and the audience wasn't following her cues anymore. She forced a smile, her tone light but edged with unease. "I guess that's why you're the philosopher in the room today, huh, Keanu? Who knew John Wick would be giving us a masterclass on grief?" It was meant to draw a laugh, a reset button for the crowd. But the joke didn't land. The audience wasn't here for jokes now. They were here for the truth that had settled into the studio like a quiet tide. Keanu's expression didn't change. He didn't react with offense, nor did he take the bait to lighten the mood. Instead, he let Whoopi's words hang in the air, untouched, until they dissolved into the stillness. Then, he leaned in slightly, his voice soft but clear. "It's not philosophy," he said. "It's survival." The simplicity of that line made Whoopi pause. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. It was just true. And the truth had a way of making even the most seasoned host realize they were no longer in control. Keanu continued, his words flowing gently but with undeniable presence. "People think these things we carry, the necklaces, the rings, the photos, they think they're crutches. But they're not. They're anchors. They keep us from drifting too far from who we love, even after they're gone." A hush swept through the studio. The audience's attention was no longer scattered. It was laser-focused on Keanu, hanging on to every syllable as if it was articulating something they had always felt but never dared to say aloud. Whoopi's smile softened. She knew she had lost the segment in the traditional sense. This was no longer an interview she was leading. It was a conversation she was being invited into, whether she was ready or not. "I didn't mean to," she started, her words trailing off as she searched for footing. Keanu offered her a gentle out. "I know," he said simply. "Sometimes we laugh because it's easier than sitting with the silence." His gaze was kind, not condemning. It was the kind of look that disarmed instead of defended. That, more than anything, caught Whoopi off guard. She had expected resistance, maybe even a quiet rebuttal. What she hadn't expected was Keanu's grace, his ability to hold the room without needing to win. And that grace was what unraveled her usual armor. The audience could feel it. The dynamic had shifted permanently. Whoopi, once the conductor of the conversation, now found herself being led, not by force, but by truth. And the truth was something the audience wasn't willing to let go of now. The stillness in the studio was thick, like the air itself had taken on weight. Keanu's words had settled into every corner, leaving no space for performance or pretense. The conversation had shifted, though no one had said it aloud. It wasn't about entertainment anymore. Then, from the third row, a woman stood up. She was small in stature, middle-aged, with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if holding them steady was her only defense against trembling. Her movement wasn't dramatic. She didn't call attention to herself with a loud voice or sweeping gestures. She simply stood, and the weight of her presence was enough to pull every eye in the room toward her. I know what you mean," she said, her voice soft but firm. The microphone picked it up, crisp and clear, yet it wasn't just her words that silenced the studio. It was the sincerity in her tone. She reached into the collar of her blouse and pulled out a delicate gold chain. At its end dangled a small heart-shaped locket, worn smooth at the edges from years of touch. "My mother passed away 7 years ago," she began, her eyes flickering between Keanu and the locket in her hands. "Before she died, she cut a small lock of her hair and placed it inside this locket. She told me, 'Whenever life feels too heavy, you hold this, and remember, I'm with you.'" She paused, swallowing hard. The audience leaned in, not wanting to miss a single word. "I used to hide it," she continued. "People at work would laugh, say it was weird, creepy even. They'd joke that I should get over it, that I shouldn't still be carrying a piece of hair around my neck like some old relic." Her hands trembled as she looked down at the locket. "But I couldn't let it go, not because I was trapped in the past, but because it's the only thing that makes her feel close when everything else feels so far away." Keanu's gaze never left her. He listened, not as a celebrity being polite, but as a human being fully present. He didn't interrupt. He didn't nod performatively. He simply sat in that moment with her, giving her story the space it deserved. The audience was no longer an audience. They had become witnesses. Their expressions softened, their posture shifted. What had begun as a celebrity interview was now transforming into a shared space of vulnerability, a rare moment of collective humanity that no one had anticipated. Whoopi watched the woman with a tight expression, her usual composure slipping. She had spent her career in control of conversations, but now she was an observer, watching as the energy of the room drifted further away from the safe structure of her show and into uncharted emotional territory. She wasn't the anchor anymore. The woman's voice wavered, but she pressed on, as if speaking these words out loud was something she had been waiting to do for years. "I used to feel ashamed for still wearing this," she said, holding up the locket for the entire room to see. "Ashamed because people would roll their eyes or whisper behind my back. But today, listening to you, Keanu, I realized it's not about the locket. It's about the promise." A hush swept through the studio. You could feel it. The audience wasn't just watching a show anymore. They were leaning into a shared experience, the invisible walls between strangers dissolving as if her story had unlocked something personal in each of them. Keanu's expression was one of quiet reverence. He offered no interruption, no spotlight-stealing response. He simply nodded, a small gesture that spoke volumes. It was an acknowledgement, not just of her courage to speak, but of the sacredness of what she was holding on to. "I don't want to hide it anymore," the woman said, her grip on the locket tightening slightly. "Because it's not a weakness, it's my strength." Her words, though simple, resonated through the studio like a ripple in water. Heads nodded throughout the audience, not in politeness, but in solidarity. Keanu leaned slightly forward, his voice soft but firm. "That's what I've learned too," he said, speaking directly to her. "The world will always try to tell you what's acceptable to carry, but they don't know your weight. They don't know your heart. Only you do." The woman's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she smiled, a genuine cathartic smile that seemed to lift something off her shoulders. The studio was no longer a set. It had become a sanctuary. Whoopi watched from her seat, shifting uncomfortably. She could feel it, the room slipping further away from her scripted segment, becoming something raw and unscripted, something she hadn't prepared for. Her usual defenses, wit, control, redirection, felt useless now. The audience wasn't looking to her to navigate this moment. Their eyes were on Keanu, on the woman with the locket, and on each other. A man a few rows back dabbed his eyes discreetly. Another woman clutched a bracelet on her wrist, her fingers rubbing over its surface as if rediscovering its meaning. It was subtle, but the shift was undeniable. The studio, once a place for headlines and viral sound bites, was now a communal space of remembrance. Whoopi inhaled, preparing to regain control with a clever line, but the words caught in her throat. She realized that anything she said now to pivot would feel hollow, forced, and the audience would know it. She wasn't ready for this turn. This wasn't what the segment was supposed to be, but it was happening, with or without her. The woman slowly sat back down, her locket still visible against her chest, but the impact of her words lingered. The audience wasn't shifting uncomfortably anymore. They were grounded, as if that small act of vulnerability had given everyone permission to feel what they had been hiding for far too long. Keanu's expression remained calm, yet his eyes glistened with a quiet depth that said more than words could. He didn't need to fill the silence. He allowed it to live. And in that space, something profound was unfolding. Whoopi glanced at her co-hosts, hoping for a signal to shift the conversation, to find a thread that could steer them back to safer waters. But none of them moved. One co-host had her hand gently placed over her mouth, visibly affected, while another simply stared down at his notes, the words on the page now meaningless. It was the first time Whoopi felt the weight of being out of sync with her own audience. She had always been able to read a room, to pivot, to masterfully guide conversations back to where they needed to be. But this time the room wasn't following her. They were following something else. Something real. Keanu leaned back slightly, his gaze sweeping across the faces in the crowd. His presence was steady, grounding, like an anchor in a storm of emotions that no one had expected to confront today. "What she just did," he said softly, nodding toward the woman with the locket. "That's courage. Speaking truth when it's easier to stay quiet." His words weren't loud, but they resonated with the kind of power that doesn't need volume to be heard. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience, not the kind of murmur that precedes applause, but one that comes from people recognizing a shared feeling. Whoopi felt it too, though she wasn't ready to admit it. She shifted in her chair, adjusting her posture, as if sitting taller could somehow pull the focus back to her. "Well, Keanu," she said, forcing a light laugh, "you've definitely brought the mood down today, haven't you?" It was a weak attempt to inject humor, but no one followed her lead. The audience wasn't interested in being pulled out of this moment. They had settled into it, and they weren't letting go. Keanu's smile was gentle, patient. "Maybe it's not about bringing the mood down," he said. "Maybe it's about bringing it back to where it belongs, closer to the heart." That statement hit harder than any sharp retort could have. Whoopi exhaled, realizing the usual script had crumbled. This was no longer her show to direct. It had become something else entirely. The energy in the studio had transformed. It wasn't about Keanu's films or celebrity anecdotes anymore. It was about presence, about people being seen, about a simple necklace, a tiny locket, and the weight of the promises we keep long after the people we love are gone. Whoopi sat back in her chair, her usual composure faltering as she watched the audience lean further into Keanu's quiet strength. The control she had always relied on, her wit, her timing, her ability to command a room, felt distant now. But beneath the discomfort, something stirred, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She cleared her throat, trying to find her voice, but when she spoke, it wasn't with her usual sharpness. It was softer, edged with hesitation. "You know," she began, her eyes fixed on a spot on the desk. "I get what you're saying, Keanu. I do." Her fingers tapped against her cue cards, though she wasn't reading them anymore. "I had a brother." The words came out before she could fully prepare for them. The audience quieted even further. Keanu's eyes met hers, not pressing, just present. "His name was Clyde," Whoopi said, her voice tightening. "He passed away when I was 21. Cancer. It happened fast. One minute he was the guy who made everyone laugh louder than anyone else, and the next, he was gone." She paused, taking a breath, but it didn't steady her. "I didn't go to his funeral." The admission hung in the air, raw and exposed. The audience, once eager for celebrity gossip and lighthearted moments, now sat still, holding space for something much heavier. "I was starting my career," Whoopi continued, her tone brittle but honest. "I told myself I had to keep going, had to stay strong, had to not fall apart. I had an audition that week and I thought, what good is crying going to do? So I didn't. I went to work, I smiled, I joked, I acted like it didn't touch me." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. "But it did. It touched everything." Keanu listened, his body language unchanged, yet his attention so fully on her that it felt like the only thing keeping the room grounded. He didn't interrupt. He waited, allowing her to release the words that had been trapped under years of showbiz armor. "I kept telling myself that if I just worked harder, if I just stayed busy, the grief would, I don't know, disappear, I guess." Whoopi's lips curled into a sad smile. "But it doesn't, does it?" Keanu's response was gentle, but it carried a weight that filled the entire studio. "Grief doesn't disappear because we hide it behind success," he said. "It just waits." The simplicity of his statement struck deeper than anything elaborate could have. Whoopi inhaled sharply, as if the words had hit a part of her she had spent years building walls around. The audience didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They sat in reverent silence, watching a woman who had made a career out of controlling the narrative, now sitting exposed in a truth she could no longer edit. Whoopi's hands were no longer fidgeting with the cue cards. They rested, palms flat on the table, as if bracing herself against the memories that had suddenly surfaced. Her voice, so often the loudest in the room, now came out softer, more uncertain. "You know, I always thought grief was something you outran. Like if you moved fast enough, kept busy enough, it wouldn't catch up to you." She let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but it carried no humor. "But it does, eventually it does." Keanu's eyes never left hers. He nodded slightly, giving her the space to keep going without pressure. His silence wasn't passive, it was a quiet invitation. "I've spent years telling people to toughen up," Whoopi admitted, her voice steadying as she continued. "Telling people to put on a brave face, to keep pushing forward. And every time I did that, I thought I was being strong. But sitting here now, I wonder if I was just avoiding the one thing that scared me most." She glanced down at the table, feeling it. Her confession shifted something in the room. You could see it in the audience's posture. They weren't leaning back in their seats anymore. They were leaning in, drawn to the rawness of the moment. The set lights felt dimmer, the space more intimate, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Keanu's voice, when it came, was calm, but carried a resonance that filled every inch of the studio. "It's easier to keep moving than to stop and feel," he said. "But the truth is, grief doesn't ask us to stop living. It asks us to carry it with us, and the longer we pretend it's not there, the heavier it becomes." Whoopi looked up, meeting his gaze. For a moment, the bravado she was known for had vanished. She didn't look like a host managing a live segment. She looked like a sister who had been running from her own memories for far too long. "I used to think that showing grief was a sign of weakness," she said quietly. "That if I let people see how much it hurt, they'd think I wasn't strong enough to handle life." She shook her head, a sad smile tugging at her lips. But maybe pretending it doesn't hurt is what really weakens you over time. Keanu nodded, his voice as steady as ever. It doesn't make you less to feel it. It makes you human. And the people we've lost, they don't disappear when we carry them with us. They stay alive in the way we choose to remember them. The weight of his words pressed gently into Whoopi's defenses. For the first time, the audience saw her not as a television icon, but as a woman slowly realizing that the grief she buried had been shaping her life in silence. Whoopi exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing, as if something inside her had finally surrendered. Her usual sharpness, the quick-fire remarks and guarded humor, had faded. What remained was a quiet vulnerability that filled the space with more weight than any scripted moment ever could. "I've carried him in silence for so long," she said, her voice steadier now but lined with a fragile honesty. "Not because I wanted to forget, but because I thought that's what strong people do. You lock it away, you keep going. You don't let the world see how much it broke you." She paused, glancing toward the audience, her eyes softer. "But maybe that's not strength at all. Maybe strength is this." Saying it out loud. Keanu's face held no judgment, only a gentle understanding. "It is," he said quietly. "Saying their names, telling their stories, holding on to the things that made them real. That's how we keep them with us. Silence doesn't protect us from grief. It just isolates us in it." The audience's connection to the moment was palpable. Several were visibly moved, wiping away tears without shame. The energy in the studio had transformed. No longer an interview, no longer a performance. It had become a shared space of remembrance and release. Whoopi looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edges of the cue cards she no longer needed. "You know," she began, her voice tinged with reflection, "I used to think I was doing Clyde a favor by not dwelling on it. Like, if I didn't talk about him, the pain wouldn't touch me. But the truth is, I haven't stopped thinking about him. I just stopped saying it out loud." Keanu leaned in, his tone calm yet resonant. "Grief isn't something you escape by running faster. It's something you learn to walk with, and sometimes carrying their memory openly is the only way we can keep moving forward without losing ourselves." The words seemed to lift something off Whoopi's chest. She sat back, not defeated, but relieved, as if a weight had shifted. Not vanished, but shifted into a place where it could be acknowledged rather than hidden. The audience felt it too. The woman with the locket clutched it closer. A man near the back wiped his eyes, no longer hiding the emotion. The room was breathing differently now. Whoopi smiled, small but sincere. "Clyde would have liked you," she said, her voice warmer. "He had this way of cutting through people's nonsense with kindness. You remind me of that." Keanu's smile was gentle, and in that shared glance, something unspoken passed between them. This wasn't a victory or a lesson. It was a moment of two people, two siblings still carrying the weight of loss, recognizing each other in the silence. The segment wasn't over, but something inside Whoopi had shifted. For the first time, she wasn't holding the show together. She was letting it breathe. The air in the studio was dense, thick with a silence that no one dared to break. Whoopi Goldberg sat still, her earlier attempt to lighten the mood now a distant memory. She wasn't hiding behind cue cards or clever quips anymore. She was present, exposed, and Keanu Reeves saw it. He leaned forward, his posture calm, his presence unshaken. His voice, when it came, was soft, but it cut through the stillness with precision. "Whoopi," he asked, "do you ever forgive yourself for not saying goodbye?" The question wasn't an attack. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a gift. One that stripped away every layer of defense she had been clinging to. Whoopi inhaled sharply, the words hitting a part of her she wasn't prepared to confront. She opened her mouth to respond, instinctively reaching for a deflection, a way to dodge. But the usual exit routes weren't there. The audience wasn't looking for a punchline, they were waiting for her truth. She shifted in her chair, her fingers lacing together tightly as if to ground herself. I don't think I ever have, she admitted, the words fragile, as if saying them out loud might break her. I told myself I didn't need to, that it was better to just keep moving forward, but now, sitting here, her voice trailed off and she shook her head, her eyes glassy. I realize I've been carrying that moment with me every single day. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He let the silence linger, knowing that it wasn't empty. It was doing the work words couldn't. When he finally spoke, his tone was even softer, more deliberate. Forgiveness isn't about pretending it didn't happen. It's about allowing yourself to feel what you've been running from. He paused, his gaze steady. Grief doesn't come with closure. That's a word people invented to make themselves feel better about loss. Grief isn't something you fix. It's something you carry. And it's not a burden. It's a connection. The audience was rapt. Every face, every breath was tuned into this exchange. The show's tempo wasn't Whoopi's anymore. It wasn't Keanu's either. It belonged to the moment itself, a rhythm that didn't care about commercial breaks or segment transitions. Keanu leaned in slightly, closing the distance between them, his voice a soft hum that resonated through the studio. My sister's been gone for years, he said, but she still speaks to me. Not through signs, not in dreams. It's quieter than that. It's in the stillness, in the spaces between everything. When I breathe, when I slow down enough to listen, I can feel her. She's not gone, she's just different. Keanu's words didn't rush. They flowed, steady and certain, like they had been lived before they were ever spoken. The audience sat transfixed, not because of celebrity allure, but because they recognized a truth in his calmness, a truth that most people spend their lives avoiding. Whoopi's expression softened. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't performing. She looked at Keanu, her lips parting as if to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, she nodded, a small, vulnerable gesture that spoke louder than anything she could have said. I always thought grief had a finish line, Whoopi said quietly, her voice almost trembling. Like if I worked enough, laughed enough, filled my life with enough noise, it would fade into the background. But it doesn't. It just waits for the quiet. Keanu's eyes reflected a deep understanding. That's where it lives, he said gently. In the spaces we're too afraid to enter. But it's not there to hurt us. It's there to remind us that love doesn't disappear. It just changes form. The audience was no longer an audience. They had become part of the conversation, not with words, but with their shared stillness. A collective understanding was unfolding in that room. Something that didn't need applause or validation. Do you ever get angry? Whoopi asked, her voice raw, stripped of pretense. Angry that it still hurts? That even after all this time, it can hit you out of nowhere? Keanu nodded, his response measured but honest. Of course, I get angry. I get tired of it. But then I remind myself, it hurts because it mattered. It hurts because she mattered. And every time I feel that ache, I choose to see it as a reminder that she's still with me. Not in the way I want, but in the way I need. His words resonated not as a lesson, but as a lived truth. The audience could feel it. You could see it in the way people sat forward, their bodies leaning into the gravity of the moment. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't polished. It was real. Whoopi took a breath, her usual armor absent. I've spent my life telling others to be strong, to keep moving, but maybe being strong isn't about moving on. Maybe it's about learning to sit with it, to let the silence speak. Keanu smiled softly. That's where the healing starts, not in forgetting, not in rushing past it, but in sitting with it long enough to hear what it's been trying to tell you. The studio wasn't a stage anymore. It had become a mirror, a space where everyone, including Whoopi, was seeing parts of themselves they had kept buried under layers of distraction. And in that moment, there was no need to fill the air. The stillness was speaking louder than any script ever could. Whoopi leaned back in her chair, her posture less guarded now, as if a burden had been shifted, not lifted, but finally acknowledged. Her eyes, once darting to the control room for cues, stayed fixed on Keanu. "You know," she said softly, "for years I told myself I was fine, that moving forward meant leaving it behind. But it never left. It just sat there, waiting for the quiet moments to remind me." Keanu's voice, still calm, carried the weight of someone who had lived those quiet moments too. "Because that's when we're honest," he said. "In the stillness. That's when the noise stops pretending it's protecting us." The audience could feel the shift. The tension that once hung in the air had evolved into something warmer, more human. People were no longer watching a celebrity interview. They were watching two people, each carrying their own quiet grief, finding common ground in the space between words. Whoopi's lips curled into a small, almost sheepish smile. "I think I've been scared of silence my whole life," she admitted. "Scared of what it would tell me if I actually sat with it." Keanu nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Silence isn't empty. It's full of everything we've been too busy to hear. The people we've lost, the promises we made to them. They don't shout. They whisper. And we have to slow down enough to listen." A woman in the front row wiped her eyes, no longer concerned with hiding her emotions. Another man further back leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together, as if holding onto something fragile within himself. The studio, once a place for scripted moments and rehearsed laughter, had become a sanctuary where presence was the only script. Whoopi exhaled, her smile fading into something more reflective. "Clyde would have loved this moment," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was the quiet one, the one who didn't need to fill every space with words. I think he understood this long before I did." Keanu's gaze softened. "Then maybe today is his way of reminding you." The simplicity of that line struck deeply. There was no need for grand gestures or dramatic music. The moment itself was enough. Whoopi, once the conductor of the show's pace, sat still, no longer trying to lead, but choosing to follow. The audience remained silent, not because they were told to, but because they understood that clapping or cheering would break something sacred. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a moment of collective honesty. Keanu leaned back, his posture relaxed, but his presence unwavering. The tempo of the show wasn't dictated by segments or scripts anymore. It was being guided by the weight of what mattered. And in that space, Whoopi wasn't the host, and Keanu wasn't the guest. They were simply two people sitting with the echoes of their loved ones, allowing the silence to speak. The studio was silent, but it was no longer a heavy silence. It was a living silence, breathing with the unspoken stories sitting in every corner of the room. Keanu's words had opened a door that could no longer be closed, and the audience felt it. No one had asked them to speak, but they didn't need permission anymore. From the fifth row, a young man stood up. He was in his 20s, his hands clenched nervously at his sides, his body trembling as if standing was an act of courage in itself. His voice was soft at first, but clear enough to carry through the studio. I used to make fun of my brother for wearing a St. Christopher medal," he said, glancing down as if ashamed. "I told him it was silly, that it was just a piece of metal. He never argued. He just smiled and said it gave him comfort." The young man's voice cracked slightly. "Last year he passed away. Car accident. The medal was found in his pocket." He reached into his own jeans and pulled out a small, worn medallion, holding it up for the audience to see. "I've carried it with me every day since, and until this moment, I've never told anyone that." Keanu's gaze met the young man's, his expression soft, open, and welcoming. He didn't interrupt. He didn't shift the attention back to himself. He simply nodded, a silent gesture that said, "I see you." The young man, emboldened by that quiet acknowledgement, slowly sat down, his hand still wrapped around the metal as if it had become heavier, yet more meaningful. The studio held that moment with care, but it wasn't over. A few seats over, a woman in her 60s reached into her purse. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she had waited years for this exact moment. She stood, holding up a delicate silver bracelet. "This belonged to my husband," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "He gave it to me on our 10th anniversary. When he passed, people told me to stop wearing it, said it would keep me trapped in the past. So I stopped. I kept it in my purse, thinking that was enough. But it wasn't." Her fingers traced the bracelet's charm, a small engraved heart. "Today, I think I'm ready to wear it again." Keanu's expression softened further, his attention fully on her. "Thank you for sharing that," he said, his voice calm but filled with meaning. "What we carry isn't just about memory. It's about love continuing in a form we can still touch." The audience felt the shift. The walls of television formality were crumbling. People were no longer audience members. They were participants in a quiet uprising of truth, vulnerability, and remembrance. Whoopi watched, her eyes wide, visibly overwhelmed. The studio wasn't hers anymore. It had transformed into something bigger than the show, bigger than ratings. It had become a sanctuary. The wave of courage continued. From the far left of the studio, an elderly man stood up, his hands trembling as he adjusted a worn-out cap. His voice was gravelly but strong. "My wife passed 3 years ago," he said, holding up a faded handkerchief. "She embroidered this herself, carried it everywhere. After she was gone, people told me I should let it go, that keeping a handkerchief in my pocket was silly, but I never could. It's the only thing that still smells like her." The room remained still, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken understanding. Keanu gave the man a small nod of respect. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone told every person in that room that their stories mattered. One by one, more people began to stand. A woman held up a weathered photograph of her son, the edges curled and fragile. A man revealed a tiny charm tied to his shoelace, explaining it belonged to his sister, who had passed when they were teenagers. Each object, once hidden away out of fear of being seen as weak or stuck in the past, now became a symbol of strength, of resilience, of enduring love. Keanu listened to every story, his attention never wavering. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush the moment. Each person was given space to share, space to breathe, space to feel seen. His responses were simple but powerful. A nod, a soft thank you, a glance that told them they weren't alone in their grief. The atmosphere in the studio had transformed completely. There was no longer a clear distinction between the stage and the audience. The invisible wall that separates performers from viewers had dissolved. They were all just people now, standing in a shared vulnerability that had been kept silent for far too long. Whoopi sat back, her eyes darting from one person to another. She had hosted countless interviews, sat across from presidents, actors, activists, but never had she witnessed her studio turn into something so human, so unscripted. She was no longer steering the ship. The ship was moving on its own, powered by a current she could neither stop nor redirect. Her co-host sat in quiet awe, visibly moved by the flood of testimonies. There were no prepared cue cards to guide them through this, no rehearsed lines to ease the weight. The show had surrendered to the truth that was pouring out from every corner of the room. Keanu's presence remained the steady center of it all. He wasn't leading by force, he was leading by listening. The more he listened, the more people stood up, as if his quiet validation gave them the courage to bring their grief into the open, to carry it not as a burden, but as a badge of love that refused to be silenced. From the back row, a teenage girl stood, her hands visibly shaking as she clutched a small necklace. Her voice wavered as she spoke. "This belonged to my grandma. She passed away last winter. I used to hide it under my hoodie because my friends thought it was old-fashioned. They'd tease me, ask why I was dressed like a church lady." She paused, her grip tightening around the chain. "But I never stopped wearing it. Not really. I just stopped letting people see it." The room listened with a stillness that felt sacred. Keanu's gaze found her, and his smile was soft, reassuring. "Thank you for sharing that," he said, his tone as gentle as a whisper, yet filling the entire space. "You're not hiding her anymore. She's with you, right here." The girl smiled, her shoulders relaxing as she tucked the necklace back under her hoodie, but this time with a different posture, not of hiding, but of honoring. What had begun as isolated moments was now a movement within the room. People were no longer waiting for a microphone to be passed. They were standing up, one after another, lifting rings, bracelets, photos, even folded notes that had been carried for years in wallets and purses. Each item was small, almost insignificant in material worth, but in that moment, they became monuments of memory. Whoopi watched, her hands clasped together on the desk, no longer as a host managing a segment, but as someone witnessing something that could never have been scripted. The transformation unfolding in front of her was bigger than television. It was bigger than any interview. The studio had become a space of shared humanity, where grief was not just spoken, but embraced. Keanu remained the anchor, not commanding attention, but holding space for every person who stood. His silence wasn't empty. It was a presence that allowed others to fill it with their truth. Every time someone shared, he listened. Not as a celebrity nodding politely, but as a person who knew the weight of what they were carrying. A man near the front stood, holding a small music box. "This was my daughter's," he said, his voice trembling. "She used to play it every night before bed. After she passed, I couldn't listen to it anymore, but I also couldn't throw it away." His eyes glistened as he added, "I brought it with me today, because I thought it was time to let it go. But now, I think it's time to let it play again." Keanu smiled gently. "Then let it play. For her. For you." That simple exchange sent a ripple through the room. People weren't just telling stories anymore. They were reclaiming their symbols, their memories, turning what the world had mocked or ignored into declarations of love. Whoopi's voice, when it returned, was quieter than it had ever been. "This isn't a show anymore, is it?" she said, almost to herself. And in that moment, everyone in the studio knew the answer. The energy in the studio had shifted beyond recognition. What began as an interview was now something else entirely, a collective release of stories and grief that had been held in silence for far too long. The audience had spoken. Their tokens of memory had become symbols of courage, but the next moment would push the boundaries even further. From behind the main camera, a man in his early 60s slowly removed his headset. His salt and pepper hair framed a face lined with years of quiet professionalism. He was a seasoned cameraman, someone who had spent decades capturing moments for others, always in the background, never part of the story. But today, something inside him had changed. Without a word, he stepped out from behind the camera. The control room crackled with confused voices, directors questioning what was happening, but no one moved to stop him. He walked towards the center of the set, his steps steady, though his hands trembled slightly. The audience turned, their attention shifting from Keanu and Whoopi to the man breaking the invisible barrier between production and presence. In his hand, he held a small, tattered photograph. Keanu watched him, his gaze soft and open, giving space for what was about to be shared. The cameraman stopped a few feet from the main stage. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was gravelly and raw. "I've worked on this show for 22 years, he said, holding up the photo gently. "And I've never stepped in front of a camera. Never thought I needed to." He paused, his fingers tightening around the photo as if afraid it might slip from his grasp. "This is my daughter, Emily," he continued, his voice cracking. "She was 17 when we lost her. A drunk driver hit her car. It was one of those things you see in the news and you never think it'll be you. But it was." The audience listened, hanging on to every word, their breaths collectively held, as if exhaling might shatter the fragile courage it took for him to speak. "I've carried her photo in my pocket every single day since," he said, lifting the small, weathered picture for everyone to see. "But I've never shown it to anyone here. Never had the courage. I thought people would think I hadn't moved on, that I was stuck in the past." His shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of years of silence pressing down. "But after what's happened here today, I realized I don't want to move on. I want to move forward. With her." Keanu stood. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He crossed the stage slowly, each step measured and respectful, until he stood in front of the man. Then, gently, he placed a hand on his shoulder. The moment wasn't choreographed. It wasn't for the cameras. It was for them. The cameraman's face crumpled, and the room, holding its breath, seemed to collectively exhale, as if they too had been carrying something that had finally been given permission to be seen. Keanu's hand remained on the cameraman's shoulder, not as a gesture of pity, but as a quiet affirmation. The crew member didn't need words of comfort. He needed to be seen. And in that moment, he was fully without judgment, without performance. The audience sat in a reverent hush, the air so still that the soft hum of the stage lights became the only background noise. The man looked up, meeting Keanu's eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, though it wasn't clear if he was thanking Keanu, the audience, or the moment itself. Perhaps it was all three. Keanu nodded, his response as simple and profound as his presence. "Thank you for trusting us with her." The cameraman's fingers brushed the edge of the photograph one more time before carefully tucking it back into his pocket. But the act wasn't one of hiding anymore. It was different now. It was a gesture of carrying her forward, no longer in silence, but in shared remembrance. The studio's invisible wall between those on stage and those behind the scenes had shattered completely. This wasn't a segment for ratings. It wasn't a carefully constructed emotional beat. It was a human reckoning unfolding live, impossible to edit, impossible to script. Whoopi Goldberg, sitting at her desk, felt it deeply. She had watched countless stories play out in this studio, but she had never seen one take on a life of its own in this way. She had lost control of the segment, and yet it had never been more alive. The show was no longer hers to direct. It had become something sacred. She stood slowly, her eyes glassy, her hands trembling slightly as she steadied herself against the table. She didn't speak. She couldn't. She watched as the man returned to his camera, this time not as a crew member hidden behind the lens, but as a father who had been witnessed. The audience, still seated, felt the shift. A few reached into purses and pockets, clutching their own tokens of remembrance. They didn't need to stand up or speak aloud. The act of holding those memories in shared silence was enough. Keanu returned to his seat, his movements slow, his presence still. His actions had said more than any grand speech could. The studio was no longer a stage. It was a space of collective humanity, where grief wasn't something to move past, but something to hold with reverence. Whoopi found her voice, but it wasn't the commanding tone she was known for. It was softer, stripped of its usual polish. "I've been on television a long time," she said, her voice steadying with every word. "But I've never seen a moment like this." Her eyes found Keanu's. "And I've never felt this changed." The audience remained silent. No applause, no cues, just the quiet power of a room full of people breathing in a moment they knew would never come again. In that studio under those lights, something had shifted. It wasn't a talk show anymore. It was a sanctuary, and no one, not the crew, not the hosts, not the viewers, would leave the same. Whoopi stood quietly at her desk, her hands resting flat against its surface. The weight of the moment seemed to settle into her bones, and for once, she didn't fight it. The studio had grown impossibly still, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. Her eyes shifted to a drawer beneath the desk. It wasn't part of the show. It wasn't meant to be opened today. But something inside her knew it was time. Slowly, with a trembling hand, she reached down and pulled the drawer open. From within, she retrieved a small, simple silver ring. It wasn't flashy. There were no diamonds or engravings, just a plain band, worn at the edges, dull from years of neglect. She held it in her palm, staring at it for a long moment before speaking. "This," she said softly, her voice losing the sharpness that had always been her signature, "belonged to my brother, Clyde." The audience listened in silence. There was no need for applause, no expectation for a witty line to break the tension. They understood the gravity of what was happening. "I haven't looked at this ring in decades," Whoopi continued, her fingers brushing over its surface, as if rediscovering its texture. "It's been buried under scripts, contracts, makeup kits, and all the things I thought were more important. I kept telling myself I'd forgotten about it, that I'd moved on." Her lips pressed together tightly as her gaze dropped to the ring. "But I never did." She lifted the ring slowly, her hands shaking as she slid it onto her finger. It didn't fit as smoothly as it once had, but she didn't force it. She let it rest where it naturally belonged. "I used to mock people for wearing things like this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mocked people who showed their grief too openly, who carried their losses where the world could see. I told myself it was a defense mechanism, a way to help them toughen up." She paused, her throat tightening. "But the truth is, I think I was mocking myself." Keanu didn't move. He didn't nod, didn't offer a knowing glance. He simply sat there, present, holding space for her without demanding it. Whoopi's eyes glistened, but she didn't wipe the tears away. She allowed them to fall, unhidden, as if the very act of acknowledging them was a form of healing. "Every time I saw someone clinging to a keepsake, I saw myself," she said. "And I couldn't face that reflection, so I made it a joke. Because it's easier to laugh at something than it is to feel it." Her voice wasn't shaky anymore. It was steady, honest, and stripped of the layers she had built over a lifetime of needing to be strong. "I think I've been afraid to wear this ring," she said, her gaze lifting to meet Keanu's. "Because I knew what it would mean if I did. It would mean admitting I'm still carrying him, that I haven't let him go." Keanu's eyes remained soft, his expression calm and unwavering. He didn't respond with words. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough, a quiet confirmation that Whoopi didn't need to explain, defend, or diminish what she had just revealed. The silence between them was not awkward. It was necessary. Whoopi looked down at the silver ring now circling her finger. Her thumb brushed over it, slowly, as if reintroducing herself to a part of her she had ignored for years. "I told myself grief made people fragile," she said. "That if you showed it, you were giving the world permission to see you as weak." She shook her head gently. "But the truth is, not showing it, that's what weakens you." The audience was spellbound. Every person in the room could feel it, the layers of performance being peeled back, one by one, revealing a woman not as a host, not as a celebrity, but as a sister still grappling with loss. This wasn't the Whoopi Goldberg the world knew. This was Karen Johnson, the woman behind the name, confronting something she had buried under decades of fame. "I've built my whole life on being the one who could take a hit and laugh it off," Whoopi continued. "People expect me to be unshakable, to always have a comeback. But sitting here now, I realize Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let yourself be broken. Even if it's just for a moment. Keanu's gaze didn't falter. He remained still, present, listening in a way that made the space feel safe. His lack of interruption was its own kind of support. "I used to look at people who wore their grief openly and think they were stuck," Whoopi said. "But maybe they weren't stuck. Maybe they were brave enough to keep their love visible, even when it hurt." She exhaled, a breath that seemed to carry years of held-in emotion. "I wasn't brave. I hid it. I folded it into the parts of my life I thought mattered more." The ring glinted under the studio lights, though it was modest in design. But in that moment, it held more value than anything else in the room. "I don't know if wearing this will make the pain go away," Whoopi said, her voice softer now. "But maybe it's not supposed to." She looked back at Keanu, her tone shifting to something more open. "Maybe it's supposed to remind me that I loved him, that I still do." Keanu smiled, small and sincere. Still, he didn't fill the space with words. He let her own them. His silence wasn't passive. It was intentional. It was his way of saying, "You've got this." Whoopi's posture shifted. She wasn't leaning forward, commanding the desk like a captain steering her show. She was leaning inward, into herself, into a place she had kept locked for too long. The studio, filled with people who had come for entertainment, was now witnessing something rare, an unfiltered reckoning with grief, held not in the loud proclamations of television, but in the quiet, fragile, courageous return to presence. Keanu sat quietly for a moment, the weight of the previous exchanges settling into the studio like a sacred hush. The audience, still and attentive, wasn't waiting for entertainment anymore. They were waiting for truth. And Keanu, as he had done throughout this entire moment, offered it, not as a lecture, but as a shared reflection. He leaned forward, his hands clasped loosely, his voice gentle but carrying a calm resonance that seemed to reach every corner of the room. "Grief is not a wound you heal from," he said, his words deliberate. "It's a scar you learn to carry. It's not meant to disappear. It's meant to remind us that the love we had didn't vanish. It just changed form." The audience hung on to every syllable. His tone wasn't somber, it wasn't dramatic. It was honest in a way that made the air feel heavier, yet strangely freeing. "I carry my sister with me every day," Keanu continued, his gaze sweeping across the audience before settling softly on Whoopi. "Not because I can't move on, not because I'm trapped in the past, but because carrying her isn't an act of defiance. It's an act of devotion." Whoopi sat quietly, her posture no longer poised as a host guiding a segment, but as someone fully present, learning to see her own grief in a different light. Keanu's fingers brushed against the cross resting against his chest. The world has this idea that closure means forgetting. That if you're still carrying the weight of someone you've lost, you're not healing. But that's not true. We don't carry these memories to stay stuck. We carry them to stay connected. He paused, letting the silence breathe, letting the words settle. "I've been told to let go more times than I can count," he said. "By people who meant well, by people who didn't. But I've learned that letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying their memory with the respect and love it deserves, even when it hurts." The studio felt transformed. Every camera operator, every audience member, every crew member knew this wasn't a typical broadcast anymore. It had become something else, a quiet congregation of people learning, perhaps for the first time, that grief wasn't a burden they had to silence for the comfort of others. Keanu's eyes turned towards the camera, speaking not just to those in the room, but to the countless viewers who would be watching from their living rooms, hospital beds, classrooms, and quiet corners of the world. "If you're watching this," he said, his voice steady, "and you've been told to move on, to tuck away the symbols that remind you of who you've lost, I want you to know it's okay to keep them close. It's okay to carry them with you. His words weren't a performance. They were a permission slip. Permission for people to stop apologizing for their grief, to stop shrinking their memories, to fit into a world that didn't know how to handle the weight of love that outlives a person. Keanu's gaze remained fixed on the camera, his words flowing with a calm sincerity that left no room for pretense. "We're told that time will heal all wounds," he said. "But grief doesn't work like that. It doesn't vanish with time. It becomes a part of who we are, woven into the way we see the world, the way we love, the way we remember." He shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers brushing once more against the cross hanging at his chest. "When my sister passed, I kept waiting for the moment when it would hurt less. That's what people told me would happen, but the truth is the pain didn't fade. I just learned to live with it. And in that living, I found a different kind of peace." The audience sat frozen, but it wasn't discomfort, it was reverence. They weren't just listening, they were feeling. You could see it in their faces, in the way they clutched their own small tokens of remembrance. No longer ashamed, no longer hiding. Keanu continued, his tone unwavering, his presence filling the space without needing to raise his voice. "Grief isn't an enemy to conquer. It's not a problem to fix. It's a reflection of how deeply we loved, and when we're told to let go, what's really being asked is for us to make others more comfortable with our pain." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing not in anger but in compassion. "But the truth is, your grief isn't something to be sanitized for someone else's convenience. The necklace you wear, the ring you keep in a drawer, the photo you carry in your wallet, those are not signs of weakness. They are symbols of love that refuses to die quietly." The room felt sacred now. No longer a television studio, no longer a talk show set. It had become a sanctuary of shared humanity, where the unspeakable was finally being spoken. Whoopi listened intently, her hand resting over the silver ring now adorning her finger. She wasn't in host mode anymore. She wasn't preparing a follow-up question or searching for a segue. She was a student in this moment, absorbing every word, with the quiet realization that she had been carrying her own grief in silence for far too long. Keanu's final words were not scripted, not rehearsed, but lived. "If you've been made to feel ashamed of remembering, I want you to know, memory is not a weakness. It's a tether, a way to keep the people we've lost connected to the life we're still living." He glanced back at the audience, his expression softening. "So, don't let anyone shame you into silence. Speak their names, carry their stories, and if you wear a necklace, a ring, a photo, wear it proudly. Because that's not you being stuck. That's you carrying love forward." The audience didn't clap. They didn't need to. The power of the moment wasn't in applause, it was in the stillness, in the collective breath of people who had found themselves seen, perhaps for the first time. Whoopi exhaled, her posture softer, her eyes reflecting a quiet understanding. She wasn't leading anymore. She was learning to carry her brother differently, not in hidden drawers, but in her presence. The stillness in the studio was no longer empty. It had become alive, filled with something more powerful than words. Keanu's quiet message had not just settled into the audience, it had ignited something. One by one, hands began to rise, not for applause, but to hold something sacred. A woman near the front lifted a small velvet pouch and carefully opened it, revealing a locket. She didn't stand. She didn't speak loudly. She simply whispered Marie as her fingers traced the worn engraving. Across the aisle, an elderly man reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded American flag. His lips moved silently, mouthing a name only he could hear. But the emotion on his face said everything the microphones couldn't. A young man in his 20s, seated towards the middle, removed a bracelet from his wrist, a simple leather band. He pressed it to his lips before whispering, "Jason." The studio transformed into a wave of whispered names. One by one, they floated into the air. Some choked through tears, others spoken like a soft prayer. The sound wasn't loud, but it filled the space completely, as if the room itself was breathing. In the corner of the studio, the teleprompter operator, a man who had worked silently behind the scenes for years, lifted his hand to his face. He wiped his eyes, struggling to maintain composure, before quietly saying, "Anna." The word was barely audible, but it didn't need to be loud to be heard. In that moment, the name carried the weight of years of silent remembrance. No one instructed the cameras to capture these moments, but the camera operators, veterans of live television, knew instinctively that this was not something to miss. The lenses swept gently across the audience, capturing faces raw with emotion, hands clutching tokens of love, and lips forming names that had waited too long to be spoken aloud. Whoopi watched, her usual wit and control replaced with awe. Her eyes scanned the studio, taking in the quiet revolution that was unfolding in front of her. This was no longer her stage. It was no longer a segment designed for entertainment. It had become a sacred space, a communal reckoning with grief and love. In the control room, a producer, headset pressed against his ear, spoke softly into his mic. "We can't cut to commercial," he said, his voice trembling. "This is bigger than ratings." No one argued. No one suggested filling the silence. They all knew that to interrupt this moment would be to miss the very reason television existed: to connect people, to bear witness. Keanu remained seated, his posture calm, his expression open, as if holding the entire room steady. He didn't try to narrate the moment. He allowed it to breathe, to evolve organically, without direction. The studio had become a mirror, reflecting not just the grief of the individuals in the room, but the collective weight of unspoken stories. And in that reflection, something profound was happening. Healing. Not the kind that fixes, but the kind that acknowledges, that says, "I see you. I carry them too." The whispers continued, soft and persistent, each name falling into the air like a gentle release. There was no rhythm, no coordination, yet the moment felt orchestrated by something far greater than a production script. Each person who spoke a name was offering a piece of themselves, trusting that it would be met with understanding. A middle-aged woman, seated near the back, held up a small keychain. Its colors were faded, but her grip on it was firm, her lips forming the name David as her eyes glistened with tears. Beside her, a younger man unfolded a crumpled piece of paper from his wallet, smoothing it carefully on his lap before whispering, "Mom." The cameras didn't zoom in aggressively. They moved slowly, respectfully, capturing not the sensationalism of grief, but the quiet dignity of remembrance. The control room, often bustling with commands and cues, sat in reverent silence. The monitors showing faces no longer masked by the expectations of a television audience, but revealed in their raw humanity. Whoopi remained standing at her desk, the silver ring on her finger catching the light. She didn't speak. She didn't attempt to guide the moment. She simply watched, absorbing the wave of shared vulnerability that was transforming the space she had spent years controlling. The armor she had worn as a host was gone, replaced with a humble recognition that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step back and witness. Keanu sat still, his eyes gently scanning the room, offering his silent support to each person who dared to bring their private loss into this public sanctuary. His presence didn't overshadow the moment, it amplified it. He was no longer the guest of a talk show. He had become the keeper of the space, the steady anchor around which everyone could release what they had carried alone for so long. A stagehand, often invisible to viewers, stood near the edge of the set. He removed a pendant from around his neck, lifting it slowly as he whispered, "Elaine." His voice barely reached the front rows, but the ripple it sent through the room was undeniable. Each whispered name wasn't isolated, it connected to the next, a chain of human stories finally allowed to exist out loud. One of the camera operators, a woman with a headset slung around her neck, wiped her cheek and softly said, "Peter." There was no camera on her, but that didn't matter. Her contribution was felt, added to the collective tide of names washing over the studio. Whoopi's breath caught as she looked at the scene unfolding. It was no longer about Keanu. It wasn't even about the show. It was about every person in that room finding the courage to lift their grief out of silence, to let it breathe, to let it be seen without apology. There were no commercial breaks, no flashy transitions, no applause signs. Just a room full of people learning in real time that grief shared is not grief diminished. It becomes something else entirely, something healing, something sacred. And in that moment, the studio wasn't a place of performance. It was a place of witness. And no one wanted it to end. Whoopi's hands rested on the desk, the silver ring on her finger now a tangible reminder of everything that had shifted in the past hour. The studio was quiet, reverent, and she knew the next word she spoke had to come from a place she rarely allowed the world to see. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to the camera, her eyes glistening, her posture no longer that of a host in command, but of a human being stripped of defenses. Her voice was soft, trembling with the weight of raw honesty. "I came into this segment prepared to mock a necklace," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "I thought it was just a piece of metal. I thought it was just another Hollywood accessory to poke fun at." She paused, her throat tightening. "But I wasn't prepared for what it really meant." The audience remained silent, every eye fixed on her. The usual tension that came with unscripted moments wasn't there. This was different. This was necessary. "I've spent a lot of years on this stage," Whoopi continued, her voice steadying slightly. "Making jokes, taking jabs, keeping the mood light. It's what people expect of me. It's how I've protected myself. But today I realized that sometimes those jokes aren't harmless. Sometimes they're shields. Shields we use to keep from facing the parts of ourselves we don't want to see." Her gaze dropped for a moment, her fingers gently turning the ring on her hand. "I've mocked things I didn't understand," she admitted. "I've laughed at symbols of faith, of remembrance, because it was easier than admitting they made me uncomfortable. Easier than admitting I was too afraid to confront my own grief." She looked back up, her eyes now fully open, unguarded. "Years ago, we had a guest on this show who spoke about her faith, about how her cross gave her strength after losing her son. And I..." Her voice caught, the memory visibly painful. "I made a joke. I dismissed her, and I watched her smile falter. I watched her shrink back into herself. I didn't realize then how much damage that moment caused, but today, sitting here with Keanu, I felt it. I saw it. The room was still. The cameras captured not a celebrity host delivering a polished monologue, but a woman reckoning with herself in real time. I've spent my life telling people to be strong, to toughen up, to move on," Whoopi said. "But I wasn't leading by example. I was hiding behind my humor, behind my success, behind the idea that if I never acknowledged my own pain, it couldn't touch me." She took a breath, her hands trembling slightly. "But it does touch you. Whether you face it or not, it lives inside you." She turned her head slightly toward Keanu, her voice softening. "Your presence today, it dismantled my defenses in a way I didn't expect. You didn't fight back. You didn't clap back with a clever line. You just sat there. And in that stillness, you held up a mirror I wasn't ready to look into." Whoopi's voice wavered, but she didn't pull back. She pressed forward, her words raw, unpolished, and real. "I thought I was coming here today to lead a segment, but I was the one who needed to listen. I was the one who needed to be reminded that grief isn't something you outgrow. It isn't something you hide away so the world feels more comfortable around you." She paused, her hand unconsciously moving to the silver ring now resting firmly on her finger. I've mocked people who wear their grief. I've made light of the things they carry because seeing them made me face the fact that I've been too much of a coward to carry mine out loud. Her eyes softened, brimming with emotion. I've made jokes about faith, about loss, about symbols that were never meant to be laughed at, but I did it anyway. Not because I was cruel, but because I was scared. Keanu didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His stillness was more supportive than any scripted line could have been. The audience remained quiet, holding space for Whoopi's confession, understanding that they were witnessing something rare. A public apology not crafted for headlines, but born from genuine self-reflection. I owe an apology, Whoopi said, her voice regaining steadiness. Not just to Keanu, though God knows I owe him that, but to every guest, every person I've crossed paths with who has ever shared a piece of their heart on this show and was met with my sarcasm instead of my respect. She took a deep breath, her shoulders lowering as if releasing years of unseen tension. To the woman who sat here years ago, clutching her cross and speaking about her son, I'm sorry. I didn't listen to you. I didn't honor your story. And I realize now how much courage it took for you to even share it. Her gaze lifted to the camera, now speaking directly to the millions who would watch this moment. If you've ever been made to feel small because you carry a symbol of someone you lost, if you've ever been laughed at for wearing your grief where the world can see it, I want you to know that I was wrong. I was wrong to mock it. I was wrong to dismiss it. You were brave. You were honest. And I was hiding. The silence in the studio was profound, not heavy with awkwardness, but filled with the kind of clarity that comes only when the truth is finally spoken aloud. Whoopi's eyes turned back to Keanu, and this time her smile was gentle, unguarded. You didn't need to correct me. You didn't need to call me out. You let the moment speak for itself. And it did. Louder than any argument could have. Keanu nodded, his expression filled with quiet understanding, still offering no words, only presence. Whoopi exhaled, her voice now lighter but not dismissive. I won't pretend I've got it all figured out now. I won't pretend this ring suddenly makes me wise about grief. But today, I'm wearing it differently. Today, I'm not hiding him anymore. The audience remained seated, their silence more powerful than any standing ovation. The moment wasn't about clapping. It was about bearing witness to a woman who had lived a life in the spotlight, finally stepping into her own shadow and finding the courage to stay there for a while. Keanu sat quietly for a moment, allowing Whoopi's raw confession to linger in the air. The studio, once filled with the expectation of entertainment, had settled into a sacred kind of stillness. He looked around, his gaze meeting the faces of audience members who were no longer just spectators. They were witnesses, carriers of their own stories. Then, slowly, Keanu turned his attention to the cameras. His voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was calm, steady, and every syllable carried the weight of lived experience. I know there are people watching this right now, he began, who've been told to keep their grief quiet, who've been made to feel embarrassed for still wearing a necklace or carrying a ring or keeping a photo in their wallet. Maybe you've been told it's time to move on, to let go, to stop holding on to the past. He paused, his fingers gently tapping the cross resting against his chest. But I want you to hear this. You don't have to hide anymore. The studio remained silent, but it wasn't empty. The audience leaned in, every breath held, every heart connected in an unspoken understanding. These things we carry, Keanu continued, his voice growing softer. They're not weights that hold us down. They're tethers that keep the people we've lost close to our hearts. They are not symbols of weakness. They're symbols of love. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing with quiet intensity. I want you to say their names, he said. Not just in private, not just in your own head. Say them out loud, write them down, share them in the comments, not for us, not for this show, but for you, for them, because the world needs to hear them. The audience didn't respond with applause. Instead, heads began to nod. Tears flowed freely, unhidden. Whispered affirmations filled the air as people repeated the names of those they had carried in silence for too long. Keanu's gaze remained fixed on the camera, speaking directly to every person watching from the other side of the screen. You don't have to explain why you still carry that locket or why you still wear that ring. You don't need to justify keeping their photo on your nightstand. The people who tell you to let go, they don't understand, but you do. And that's enough. He paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing. Every name you speak, every story you share, keeps their light alive. Don't let the world shame you into silence. Reclaim their story. Reclaim your right to remember. The atmosphere in the studio shifted once again. It wasn't a performance space anymore. It had become a living memorial, where each person's grief was no longer an isolated burden, but a shared thread in the fabric of human connection. Whoopi listened, no longer as a host moderating an interview, but as someone learning how to carry her own grief differently. Her hand rested on the silver ring, her fingers now caressing it, not as a hidden relic, but as a visible act of remembrance. Keanu's voice remained gentle, yet each word seemed to strike with precision. Grief doesn't ask for permission, he said. It doesn't follow a timeline, and it certainly doesn't shrink just because the world gets uncomfortable with its presence. His gaze softened as it swept across the audience, acknowledging every tear-streaked face. But when we carry it openly, when we allow it to be seen, it stops being a burden we hide and becomes a story we share. The audience wasn't clapping. They weren't performing for cameras. Instead, they were nodding, wiping their faces, clutching the objects they had once hidden. Lockets, rings, flags, photographs. Each token now elevated from private pain to public honor. Keanu's attention returned to the camera, speaking to viewers scattered across living rooms, hospital beds, classrooms, offices, wherever someone might be silently clutching a memory, unsure if they had the right to still feel it so deeply. I want you to take a moment, he said, his tone soft but unwavering. Think of the person you've been carrying in silence. Maybe it's been days, maybe it's been decades, but their story, their name, deserves to be spoken. He paused, allowing the weight of his request to settle. If you're willing, share their name in the comments. It's not for visibility, it's not for a viral moment. It's for them, it's for you. The studio was no longer a stage. It had become a sacred space of release. Audience members began to whisper names into the air once more, but now with a sense of reclaiming. A young woman whispered, "Dad," as she clutched a keychain in her hands. An elderly man mouthed, "Eleanor," his hand gently pressed against a photo tucked into his pocket. Keanu smiled softly. This moment, this act of remembering out loud, isn't about staying in the past. It's about carrying love forward. Because love doesn't expire. It doesn't diminish with time. It evolves. It stays with us in the way we live, in the choices we make, and in the symbols we choose to keep close. He leaned back slightly, his body language open, inviting. You don't need a platform, or an audience, or a reason to keep remembering. The act of holding onto their story is reason enough. Whoopi's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She didn't interject. She didn't steer the conversation. She simply placed her hand over her heart, her thumb brushing against the ring that now felt less like a relic of sorrow and more like a living connection. Keanu's final words in that moment weren't grand or dramatic. They were simple, but their impact was profound. Your grief is a story of love that deserves to be told, so tell it. Speak their name, share their story, And if someone asks you why you still carry that necklace, that photo, that ring, you tell them it's because love doesn't get quieter just because the world stops listening. The studio, filled with a quiet chorus of nods and whispers, had become a living memorial, a sanctuary of shared humanity where grief wasn't hushed but honored. And in that space, no one felt alone. The studio had long since shed the rhythms of a typical broadcast. The countdowns, the cue cards, the scheduled transitions, they no longer mattered. This moment had become something organic, something raw, something alive. And as the quiet settled after Keanu's final words, a crew member, headset slung around his neck, approached Whoopi cautiously. He held a folded piece of paper, his expression betraying the gravity of its contents. He didn't need to explain. He simply extended the note. Whoopi accepted it with hands that trembled slightly, her eyes scanning the message as the audience watched, the air thick with anticipation. Her lips parted, and when she began to read, her voice was softer than it had been all show. "I'm watching this live," she read, her voice catching on the first few words. "I'm the woman who sat in that chair years ago, clutching my cross while trying to speak about my son's passing." The room stilled even further. Every heart recognized the weight of those words. The note continued, "I left that day feeling small, mocked, silenced. I thought I had made a mistake by believing my grief was worth sharing. But today, Keanu, you said what I couldn't. You gave my silence a voice." Whoopi's throat tightened. She paused, pressing her lips together, fighting the rising wave of emotion. The audience wasn't pressuring her to continue. They were patient, present. She took a deep breath and pressed on. "Thank you for reminding me that remembering isn't a weakness. Today, you didn't just wear a necklace. You carried all of us who have been hiding for too long." Whoopi's eyes glistened as she folded the note back into her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's watching," she said, "and she's not alone." The control room's monitors flickered with activity as a flood of live comments began pouring in. The producers didn't scramble to cut away or redirect. They let it happen. Across the screen, names began to appear. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. My father, John, he always carried a silver coin. My sister, Melanie, her bracelet is still under my pillow. For my son, Liam. I've kept his baseball cap on my desk for 5 years. Maria, my mother, she made this scarf. I'm wearing it now. Elias. My husband's name, I've never said it out loud on TV before. The messages cascaded in, not as mere comments, but as declarations of love, of memory, of stories too often hidden. Whoopi, her fingers trembling, began reading a few aloud. Each name cracked her voice further, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of human connection. Amanda, she carried a locket everywhere she went. She paused, blinking rapidly before continuing. Tommy, he always kept a handkerchief from his father. Another breath. Claire, her son's drawing is still on her refrigerator. The audience sat in stillness, the moment transcending the physical boundaries of the studio. They were no longer an audience watching a show. They were part of a global sanctuary, where grief was no longer a private burden, but a shared testimony. Whoopi's hands trembled slightly as she continued to read. Each name, each memory, was no longer just a line on a screen. They filled the room, carried in the breaths of every person watching. David, his daughter kept his watch in her backpack every day to school, she read, her voice breaking on the last word. She exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest as the moment's weight settled deeper into her. Keanu sat quietly beside her, his presence a steady anchor as the tide of shared grief rose. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His stillness allowed the names, the stories, to take center stage. The live feed didn't cut to commercial. There were no flashy graphics or sound cues to redirect attention. Instead, the screen began to scroll slowly through the endless wave of comments from viewers worldwide. For my brother Michael, I still wear his dog tags. My grandmother Rosa, I carry her recipe book in my purse. Ethan, my son's drawing of a spaceship is still on my fridge. Patricia, my best friend, I wear her bracelet every day. Each comment became a thread in a tapestry of remembrance, weaving across the globe in real time. The studio lights, often harsh and clinical, now felt warmer, softer, as if even the space itself had been transformed by the sheer honesty pouring into it. The camera captured a wide shot of the audience. People sat with eyes closed, hands clasping mementos, quietly whispering names of their own into the air. The sound wasn't loud, but it was powerful, like a heartbeat pulsing through the room. In the control booth, a young producer whispered into his headset, his voice trembling, "We're not cutting, let it roll." The decision wasn't a gamble. It wasn't about ratings. It was about understanding that something had emerged that no network script could contain. Whoopi glanced up at the camera again. The glimmer in her eyes wasn't from the studio lights, but from the weight of thousands of stories finding breath. "You're not invisible," she said softly, the words directed to every person watching from the other side of the screen. "Your grief isn't a weakness. It's proof of how deeply you've loved." She looked back at Keanu, her smile small but sincere. "You started something today," she said, "that this studio wasn't ready for, but we needed it. We all needed it." Keanu's response was a soft nod. He didn't claim credit. He didn't redirect the attention back to himself. He simply allowed the moment to continue living. The scrolling names on the screen had no end. Each one carried a heartbeat, a story, a sacred weight. And in that space, the barriers between show and viewer, stage and audience, host and guest, had dissolved completely. The studio was no longer a set. It had become a living memorial, a gathering place for stories that had waited too long in silence. And as the names continued to pour in, no one wanted to look away. No one wanted to change the channel. This wasn't television anymore. This was truth. The studio had no script left to follow, no teleprompter cues, no planned outro. The silence that filled the space wasn't awkward. It was alive. It pulsed through the air like a collective heartbeat. And then, without anyone prompting, without anyone signaling, the first person stood. She was a woman in the third row, her eyes glistening, a small pendant clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't speak. She didn't look around to see if anyone else would follow. She simply stood, holding her keepsake to her chest as if anchoring herself to the moment. Another person rose a few seats down, a young man holding a folded photograph. He didn't raise it above his head, he just stood with it, pressing it gently against his heart. One by one, the room began to change. People stood, some holding hands, others raising small, sacred objects, a bracelet, a dog tag, a folded note. The air thickened, but not with tension. It was heavy with reverence. Whoopi watched from her desk, her hand instinctively reaching for the ring now circling her finger. It wasn't a prop anymore. It wasn't a hidden keepsake. It was a visible, tangible tether to her brother's memory. Slowly, she rose from her chair, her movements not grand, but deliberate. She stepped around the desk and into the sea of people who had now filled the studio with a quiet, unified presence. Keanu stood too, but not in a way that set him apart. He didn't walk to the center, didn't raise his hands for attention. He simply stood among them, his posture as humble as anyone else's, holding his sister's cross at his chest. He wasn't a guest. He wasn't a celebrity. In that moment, he was just another person carrying a story. The cameras panned across the room, but there were no dramatic zooms, no flashy graphics. The frame was filled with people standing. Not as an audience, not as fans, but as human beings, acknowledging their shared fragility and resilience. The studio floor, once filled with the expectation of scripted moments, had become a sanctuary of presence. The usual noise of a live taping, the murmurs, the rustling, the clicks, had been replaced with a profound communal stillness. No one spoke. No one needed to. The silence itself had become the most powerful statement. Whoopi stood near Keanu, their eyes meeting for a brief, unspoken exchange. There was no need for words. The gratitude, the humility, the recognition of what had unfolded in that room was understood in a single glance. Crew members, often hidden in the shadows of production, stood too. A stagehand wiped his eyes, clutching a small charm in his fist. The teleprompter operator, headset still slung around his neck, stood with his hands folded, lips silently mouthing a name into the air. What had begun as a live segment had transformed into a moment of collective remembrance, unscripted and unfiltered. The camera pulled back slowly, revealing the entire studio standing together, not with signs, not with applause, but with presence. There was no host and guest anymore. There were no audience sections or production hierarchies. There were only people standing shoulder to shoulder, each carrying a name, a memory, a story they had once been told to hide. Whoopi remained among them, her hand resting gently on the ring that now symbolized more than a personal loss. It symbolized the silent community that had been built in real time, without planning, without agenda. She didn't need to lead. She didn't need to speak. Her presence among them said everything. Keanu stood still, not in front of them, but with them. His posture was relaxed, his hands loosely folded, the cross resting against his chest. His gaze didn't seek out the cameras. He wasn't performing. He was simply part of the fabric of the moment. The studio's usual buzz had faded into something sacred. No one was reaching for their phones. No one was glancing at the clock. Time had become irrelevant. The act of standing, of being seen in their shared vulnerability, had created a space outside of time, where silence was not emptiness but acknowledgement. And then, slowly, from the back rows, a soft murmur began. Not words, not sentences, just names. One by one, people began to whisper names into the air, not loud, not in unison, but in a ripple of remembrance. Clyde, Emmeline, Jason, Marie, Liam, Eleanor, David. The names floated through the room like prayers, each one landing softly, carried by the collective breath of everyone present. There was no rush to fill the silence. Every name was given space, allowed to exist fully in that moment. The camera didn't cut away. It lingered, capturing the raw, unscripted tableau of humanity choosing to remember together. A network executive watching the live feed whispered into his headset, "Don't you dare cut." The decision was unanimous. This wasn't about ratings. This was history in the making. Whoopi's lips parted, her voice barely audible. "Clyde," she whispered, the name trembling as it left her mouth. But this time it wasn't buried under a joke or tucked away in a private drawer. It was said out loud in front of millions, without apology. The studio floor had become a memorial, not built of stone or marble, but of people standing together in their fragile courage. There was no climax, no scripted ending, just the quiet, powerful image of human beings choosing to stand, to remember, to hold space for each other's grief. Keanu's final glance wasn't toward the cameras or the hosts. It was toward the audience, his fellow carriers of memory. And in that look, there was a silent understanding that they would all walk out of that studio different than they entered. The camera's frame widened one last time, capturing a sea of people standing not for a show, but for those they had lost. The broadcast had no outro music, no graphics, just a long, unbroken shot of people standing together. Quiet, united, seen. Keanu stood among the audience, their stories and memories hanging in the air like a quiet chorus. He didn't move toward a podium. He didn't look for a spotlight. He simply took a step forward, his hands loosely folded, his presence calm and grounded. His voice, when it came, was soft but unshakable. "We often think love requires us to be strong," he said, his eyes scanning the faces around him. "That we need to hold it together, put on a brave face, and show the world we're okay. But love doesn't demand perfection. It asks for presence." The words landed gently but deeply, weaving into the very breath of the studio. There was no resistance, no pretense, only acceptance. Keanu continued, his tone warm, each word deliberate. "The people we've lost aren't measuring us by how fast we move on or how perfectly we handle our grief. They're with us in the moments we choose to be present, in the memories we dare to share out loud, in the symbols we carry, even when the world tells us to tuck them away." He looked directly into the camera, not with the practiced gaze of a performer, but with the sincerity of someone speaking to a friend. You don't need to wait for permission to remember them. You don't need to wait for an anniversary or a public moment. You can carry them into every day, openly, boldly, without shame. The studio didn't erupt in applause. It didn't need to. The quiet nods, the hands clutching keepsakes, the soft exhales were louder than any standing ovation. Whoopi, standing beside Keanu, took a breath. The usual cadence of her voice, sharp and controlled, had softened. She looked at the audience, then back at the cameras. "Maybe," she said, her words deliberate, "maybe we don't need more talk shows." She paused, the weight of the moment settling into her shoulders. "Maybe we need more truth." The studio floor seemed to hum with agreement. There was no fanfare, no teleprompter script to follow. Just a collective understanding that something had shifted, not just in the room, but in every living room, every office, every place where someone had once felt alone in their grief. Keanu smiled gently, his posture relaxed, his presence a steadying force in a world so often rushing to the next thing. "You don't have to be okay all the time," he said. "You just have to be here, with your memories, with your love, and sometimes with your grief." The control room didn't cue up outro music. They didn't roll credits or flash graphics across the screen. Instead, the camera held the moment. This raw, unpolished tableau of people standing together, not in performance, but in presence. And then, as Keanu's final words lingered in the air, the screen began to fade. Not with a rush, but with a slow, respectful pull into black. The fade to black wasn't abrupt. It moved slowly, as if giving viewers time to hold on to the stillness, to let the weight of what had just unfolded settle into their hearts. There was no outro music, no flashy credits scrolling. Just silence. A silence so full, it seemed to echo through the screen. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was the kind that stayed with you. The kind that held names, memories, and stories that had long been waiting to be spoken aloud. Across living rooms, hospital rooms, classrooms, and quiet corners of the world, people didn't reach for their remotes. They didn't scroll away. They sat still. Some whispered names of their own. Others reached into drawers, boxes, or wallets, pulling out objects they hadn't touched in years. A necklace, a wedding ring, a folded letter. Small things, yet suddenly they felt monumental. In that collective quiet, the revolution wasn't loud. It wasn't trending hashtags or viral clips. It was people remembering out loud in their own spaces without shame. It was families sitting together in silence, each thinking of someone they loved and lost. It was a teenager alone in their bedroom, holding a photo they hadn't shown anyone since the funeral. It was a grandfather whispering his late wife's name into the stillness of a quiet home. And it was all sparked by a conversation that had dared to slow down, to stop performing, to embrace the sacredness of presence. In the control room, a producer sat back in his chair, his headset resting on the table, his eyes wet. He wasn't worried about the segment overrunning its time slot. He wasn't calculating viewer retention metrics. He just sat in awe, whispering his mother's name into the space between himself and the screen. Back in the studio, the lights had dimmed, but no one moved to pack up. Whoopi remained standing, her hand resting over her heart, fingers gently pressing against her brother's ring. The weight of it didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a tether. Keanu stood nearby, his posture unchanged. He wasn't looking for applause, he wasn't waiting for a cue. He was simply there, present, part of the human tapestry that had been woven through this unscripted, unpolished reckoning. Across the world, viewers found themselves doing something they hadn't done in a long time. They weren't rushing to the next video, the next notification, the next distraction. They were sitting with their memories, sitting with their grief, and for once, they didn't feel alone in it. That was the quiet revolution. It wasn't loud, but it was seismic. It didn't trend for clicks, but it rippled through hearts. It wasn't a finale designed for ratings. It was a moment the world would carry forward, not as content, but as connection. As the screen held its final frame of black, people everywhere didn't feel the urge to move on. They felt the permission to stay still, to remember, to carry their loved ones differently. And in a world that often demands we hide our scars, that was the most powerful thing of all.